Viator and Terra seeks to bring the latest scholarship in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We ask only for the smallest support from our audience. Liberalism sought to resolve Europe's fragmented, polyjural political landscape. Liberalism insisted that legitimate political authority must be grounded in the consent of atomized individuals and exercised through a centralized state that subjects all citizens to a single, uniform body of law. Enacting this project demanded rationalist state building in contrast with the tangled web of overlapping jurisdictions that had characterized the Middle Ages. Medieval Europe, by contrast, saw political property rights held by many actors: monarchs, bishops, lords, city councils, guilds, who bargained with one another within a decentralized, competitive order. Law was not a command from above, but a product of social groups and associations. A polyjuralism in which competing jurisdictions coexisted and overlapped without any single source claiming final, universal authority. Authority was dispersed, exercised in cross-cutting ways by ecclesiastical authorities, town councils, guilds, and manorial lords, creating a radical form of legal pluralism that the modern state would later struggle to absorb and supplant. Against this background of plural, particularistic local orders, liberalism posited that such complexity invited arbitrary power and legal insecurity. The liberal state therefore claimed for itself a monopoly of legitimate coercion and a uniform legal code that would apply equally and impersonally to all citizens, regardless of their local attachments, guild memberships, or personal loyalties. Universalism became the watchword: one law, one territory, one sovereign people. This constituted a fundamental break from the communitarian framework of medieval society, where norms were embedded in shared local practices, free associations, kinship networks, and confessional communities, and where justification for social arrangements ran through particularistic traditions rather than abstract, cosmopolitan principles. The great liberal gamble was that a centralized, rule-of-law state could guarantee more freedom than the plural, negotiated orders of the past. A gamble that would be tested and contested across battlefields, tax offices, and village squares in northern Italy for 2 centuries to come. From the 1790s onward, an increasingly self-confident liberal state has pushed law, taxes, conscription, and police into a northern Italian countryside already governed by villages, notabili, cooperatives, bosses, and at times outright bandits. The gendarme, the prefect, the cadastral surveyor, and later, the EU directive arrive in places that have long had their own rules, their own peacemakers, their own ways of hiding grain and sons. These encounters form part of a long uneven struggle over who gets to define order and justice, and whose rules actually bite on the ground. In northern Italy, that struggle is easy to miss, precisely because the end result looks so reassuringly modern to untrained eyes. This is the civic half of the country in the usual clichés of dense towns, strong municipalities, small firm capitalism, high association rates, and comparatively better public services. It is tempting to read that landscape backwards as the natural habitat of a liberal state that finally managed to impose impersonal law over parochial interests. However, the liberal state in northern Italy never arrived as an abstract Kantian referee. It arrived as a concrete package of codes, prefects, Carabinieri, and tax rolls that had to fight, bargain, and quietly merge with local powers that refused to disappear. The first encounter comes with Napoleon. Departments, communes, and gendarmes are dropped onto a mosaic of republican, city-state legacies and rural notabili. Law was now written in Paris, then Milan, and claims universal scope. The peasant village and the provincial elite were supposed to fall into line. They did not. Conscription riots, attacks on tax offices, and stubborn obstruction of cadastral surveys marked the countryside's refusal to accept that central decrees should automatically trump customary protections and local patrons. Yet the same notabili who complain about the gendarmes also learned to speak the new language of dossiers and decrees, insinuating themselves into the Napoleonic system as indispensable brokers of information and compliance. From the beginning, encroachment produces something hybrid, a stronger state that cannot function without the very local elites it is supposed to tame. Unification radicalized this pattern. The new Kingdom of Italy extended the Piedmontese liberal model of statuto, prefects, national courts, and a conscript army across Lombardy, Venetia, Emilia, and beyond. The regime decreed a universal, legally defined citizenship with claims to bring equal law to all Italians. In practice, extending land taxes, conscription, and criminal codes into the Po Valley and the Alpine foothills reopened old quarrels between center and locale. Small proprietors and sharecroppers revolted when cadastral revisions and indirect taxes squeezed already thin margins. Priests, mayors, and lawyers acted as lightning rods and intermediaries, sometimes defending local privileges, sometimes trading compliance for offices and contracts. The liberal state imagined itself as an impersonal machine. On the ground, its gears grinded through bodies and calculations in village councils, agrarian leagues, chambers of commerce, and provincial notabili. Through the 20th century, the same basic confrontation kept changing costume. Fascism presented itself as the definitive resolution by abolishing elected councils, installing podesta, turning parties into state organs, and centralizing coercion under a single ideology. Yet fascist rule in the north still relied on landlords, industrialists, and local bosses. Squadristi in Emilia and the Veneto were simply a more openly violent form of local enforcement acting in the name of Rome. After 1945, the Republican Constitution restored a liberal democratic framework and added strong guarantees of rights. But the encroaching state now had to pass through mass party subcultures. Christian Democrats in Lombard towns and communists in Red Emilia ran municipalities and regions as party-governed local states. They distributed housing, jobs, and licenses through dense networks of loyalty while still formally implementing national and later European rules. By the time Third Italy fully matured in the 1970s and 1980s, the conflict between liberal universality and local embeddedness simply migrated into a new terrain. Industrial districts in Emilia-Romagna, Veneto, and the Marche thrived on finely tuned collaboration between small firms, municipalities, regional governments, co-ops, and local banks. The central government and EU legalities insisted on transparent procurement, competition policy, and equal treatment. District actors worked constantly at the edge of those rules, bending zoning, tax, and labor norms to protect their economies. Tangentopoli in the 1990s exposed how far party business networks in Milan and other northern cities turned public contracts and planning into a system of organized rents. Subsequent waves of regionalism, federal reforms, and EU law reframed but did not remove the underlying tension. A liberal state claiming generality and local societies determined to keep governing their own turf. We trace this long confrontation from Napoleon to present times. We trace the northern Italian experience of resistance against the triumphant consolidation of a liberal, impersonal, universalist state, imposing itself over a backward local society. This two-century history of mutual encroachment has central institutions gain real capacities, yet keep seeing themselves continually forced into pacts with local elites, smallholders, party machines, and district coalitions. To understand how northern Italy looks as it does today, we have to put the liberal state back into this contentious composite landscape, where its universalist claims are always negotiated, filtered, and sometimes hollowed out by the local orders it never quite managed to replace. When French armies and administrators arrived in northern Italy after 1796, they built the Cisalpine Italian Republic and later the Kingdom of Italy as deliberate copies of France on Italian soil, establishing departments, prefects, a uniform legal code, conscription, and a centralized police. The Napoleonic Italian Republic was divided into departments, with a hierarchical subdivision into districts and communes. Each department was headed by a prefect, explicitly designed as the local intermediary of the central state. Prefects oversaw tax collection, conscription, infrastructure, law enforcement, and implementation within their jurisdictions. The Kingdom of Italy extended this model to an expanded 24 departments by 1810. Prefects and sub-prefects were appointed from above. Mayors in smaller communes were likewise appointed, not elected. Local councils existed, but their role was consultative, especially regarding budgets and taxes. The Napoleonic regime further implanted the Code Civil and associated criminal and commercial codes, giving northern Italy a relatively coherent written law of property, contract, family, and crime. Brouwers notes that the hopes of the new rulers began with the most basic responsibilities the modern state has assigned to itself: the protection of persons and property. Protection, however, came packaged with policing and surveillance on a scale few Italian villages had experienced before. For the army, Napoleon extended annual conscription to Italy. Alexander Grab quotes Neapolitan intellectual Vincenzo Cuoco's alarmed but perceptive comment in 1802. Maybe the one that will most greatly influence the future destiny of Europe will be the system of conscription. Cuoco made his remark just before the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy started providing tens of thousands of recruits to satisfy departmental quotas. The 1808 levy alone demanded 15,000 conscription of roughly 6.5 million. Finally, the gendarmerie, a uniformed armed rural police, extended its jurisdiction into Italian departments. Its commanders saw it as both a colonial force and a civilizing mission. In less than 2 decades, northern Italy was placed under a state that claimed monopoly of legitimate force, uniform law, centralized taxation, and direct access to male bodies through conscription. Napoleonic administrators did not walk into a social vacuum. Northern Italy had a layered local society shaped by city-republic traditions and rural proto-industrial economies. Centuries of communal life had produced municipal councils, guild structures, confraternities, and local magistracies, especially in Lombardy, the Veneto, and Emilia. Even under earlier princely regimes of the Visconti, Sforza, and Habsburgs, towns had retained a strong sense of corporate autonomy and a habit of negotiating with higher powers. In the countryside, northern Italian village societies had become much stratified and politically capable by the 18th century. A spectrum of rural elites, big landowners, wealthy tenant farmers, merchants, and professionals dominated village offices, credit, and local justice. These played a crucial role in representing communities towards external authorities and in the management of local resources. These notabili were neither feudal relics nor modern bourgeois in the full sense. They were hybrid figures who owned land or controlled leases, financed drainage, irrigation, mills, and proto-industrial workshops, held communal offices like consulships, anziani, or massari, and mediated between village communities and the fiscal judicial apparatus of the state. Alongside them stood a large mass of smallholders and proto-industrial households. Many Lombard and Veneto peasants combined agriculture with putting out work, silk winding, linen weaving, metalwork, and other crafts. Rural manufacturing in northern Italy grew out of peasant households engaging in small-scale industry. To the Napoleonic state, this meant that they had access to tax. Small plots, houses, livestock, and tools were liable to cadastral reform. They were already plugged into markets, making them sensitive to disruptions in prices and trade caused by war and blockade. They were socially embedded in village communities that expect to handle much of their own policing, tax apportionment, and poor relief. When the Napoleonic state arrived with its departments, conscription rolls, and gendarmes it confronted, urban and rural notabili used to exercising quasi-official power locally, peasant smallholders and proto-industrial families with finely balanced subsistence, and communal traditions that treated the village or city as a corporate actor when dealing with any prince. Thus, while the Napoleonic mission framed this encounter as between modernity and backwardness, what really collided were two systems of rule. The clash between Napoleonic centralization and northern Italian local society shows up most clearly in three interlinked policies: conscription, fiscal cadastral reform, and public order. Napoleon's conscription laws make the male village body a direct object of central policy. Yearly levies marked a radical break with older, more negotiated forms of recruitment. Draft dodging and hostility towards the regime both became prevalent among the rural population. Many recruits simply vanished and others deserted when close to home. Much of the French Empire saw riots from conscription. While the best documented large riots are in French departments, similar patterns of unrest and quiet sabotage happened in Italy. The Napoleonic regime was forced to lean on priests to preach obedience and present conscription as a civic and moral duty. Napoleonic officials tapped into clergy to encourage acceptance of the draft. Obviously, villages cared more for household survival and communal solidarity over universities' decrees mandating ever able-bodied male to join far-off wars. Families viewed, and in fact still view, sons as essential labor and security. The idea that an impersonal law can simply pluck them away was obviously morally suspect. Villages sometimes cooperated to hide youths or redirect the burden. Notabili further decided whether to help the regime or their neighbors. Italy would supply significant fiscal resources to the French Empire, both through ordinary taxes and extraordinary levies. These policies to increase taxation and rationalize collection included land taxes built on cadastral surveys that map property more systematically than many old regimes, indirect taxes on salt, tobacco, and other staples, and ultimately direct control over former ecclesiastical and communal property. Cadastral survey produced accurate maps of landholding, which threatened three groups of actors at once. Big proprietors who had quietly expanded into commons or underdeclared holdings. Communes whose customary rights to woods, pastures, or waters were at risk of being formalized away, and smallholders who feared higher tax burdens and the loss of informal arrangements. Across Napoleonic Europe, tax and conscription reforms hand in hand provoked anti-fiscal riots and everyday resistance. Italy followed the pattern. Tighter fiscal and policing measures in rural regions triggered brigandage, food riots, ambushes on tax agents, and sheltering outlaws. Rural violence here turned against symbols of the new state's extractive power. For northern Italy specifically, local elites had long managed tax apportionment themselves. Rural elites were central to managing and representing local communities and their resources to external authorities. When Napoleonic officials and gendarmes insisted on enforcing centrally fixed rates and procedures, they overrode the notabili's discretionary power in spreading burdens and rewarding clients. Now, northern Italy was obviously not Calabria, Sicily, or other clan-heavy areas of southern Italy. Northern Italian nonetheless remained a violent, factional local society. French ideological legitimacy rested on the protection on persons and property. But law enforcement and policing meant confronting growing problems of social control inherited from the old order. The gendarmerie represented the administrative and coercive logic of the new regime in its most concentrated form. Commanders understood it both as an instrument of colonial consolidation and as a vehicle for the regime's claimed civilizing project. Its mission set was broad, securing roads and villages, pursuing deserters and smugglers, escorting tax collectors and state officials, suppressing riots, and breaking up armed bands. The force protected the state's capacity to extract revenue, move personnel, enforce law, and impose regular administration across contested territory. Its operational reach, though, depended heavily on local intermediaries. Gendarmes needed the assistance of sbirri, notabili, guides, and informers to identify suspects, gather intelligence, navigate hostile terrain, and distinguish ordinary villagers from deserters, smugglers, and brigands. The force could project authority, but it could rarely generate knowledge on its own. This made the gendarmerie a hard arm of state power whose effectiveness depended on fragile local networks. There was no love lost between the gendarmes and communities under their reach. Here we see a violent force operating inside a society already structured by violence, suspicion, and negotiated authority. To local villagers, gendarmes were foreign, French-speaking intruders with broad authority. To gendarmes and prefects, local elites and sbirri were compromised by family ties, vendettas, and the lingering loyalties of the old regimes. A triangular relationship ensued. Paris and Milan insisted on regular reports, arrest quotas, and the extension of French law. Notabili simply wanted to preserve local hierarchies and control over patronage. Gendarmes and sbirri had to navigate both sets of expectations and their own survival. A patchwork of enforcement necessarily followed. Some areas saw genuine improvements in road security and a decline in open banditry. Others saw cycles of repression and backlash, as locals sheltered brigands who became symbols of resistance to the new order. Many towns and villages contended on who decided what counted as disorder. A tavern brawl, a smuggling network, or a feud killing might be treated as tolerable by notabili, but as a target by gendarmes, vice versa, depending on whose clients were involved. By 1814, Napoleon's rule in Italy had collapsed under the pressure of international war, but the machinery it installed did not disappear with the armies that had built it. Northern and central Italy had been forced through a dense institutional experiment. Departments, prefects, and sub-prefects became the administrative skeleton. Civil and criminal law were recast into uniform codes. Conscription, cadastral survey, and direct taxation became normal instruments of rule, and gendarmerie-style policing entered the countryside as a standing arm of the state. The Restoration regimes dismantled the imperial regime, yet retained much of its operating architecture. The liberal Kingdom of Italy would later draw from the same inventory. The departmental system, with the prefect as the central agent of command and transmission, had taken root deeply enough to become a template for later state building. The Napoleonic state failed as a regime, but many of its administrative weapons survived as technique. Local society absorbed the shock without being broken by it. The notabili adapted quickly, entering councils, assisting in taxation and policing when cooperation served their position, and turning themselves into brokers between state power and communal authority. Their collaboration, however, followed from calculations on access, protection, information, and local command. When the regime changed again after 1814, they carried forward the practical knowledge acquired under French rule. Peasant smallholders and proto-industrial households proved just as capable in their own regard. They learned how to evade, delay, bargain, hide men, protect resources, and use violence when pressure became intolerable. Some accepted parts of the new order, especially where road security improved or local disorder declined. Conscription, taxation, and intrusive policing generated resistance through evasion, obstruction, flight, and periodic revolt. Banditry and rural violence were suppressed in some districts, displaced in others, and reclassified as political crime when the state needed to distinguish rebellion from ordinary crime. A partial rallying of Italian elites to the Napoleonic order ensued with a partial blending of French and Italian institutions, yet all without full integration. The empire left behind only the skeletal framework of a modern state. The regime built channels of command, extraction, recruitment, policing, and legal standardization. It could not dissolve the local structures through which power actually moved. Later regimes inherited this framework: prefects, departments, codes, conscription, tax registers, and armed rural policing. It also inherited the unresolved operating problem stemming from local society's strength. The center could project a legal administrative grid across the territory, but implementation still depended on notabili, communal institutions, informers, police auxiliaries, and coercive local brokers. Reform traveled through these actors, and each actor bent it towards survival, advantage, or resistance. Napoleon's fall did not drive the advancing state out of northern Italian villages and small towns. It changed the flag, the dynasty, and the language of authority. Yeoman households, small tenants, communal officials, landowners, priests, clerks, guardsmen, and local notabili still faced a governing apparatus built around registration, taxation, surveillance, policing, and conscription. After 1815, the restored regimes inherited much of the Napoleonic administrative plant, then tried to relabel it as legitimate, paternal, and traditional. The restored regimes returned monarchy to the summit and placed dynastic legitimacy back at the center of public doctrine. They also inherited territories already altered by 18th century reform, Revolutionary War, Napoleonic administration, cadastral surveys, codified law, conscription, and police reporting. They condemned conquest and revolution while preserving many techniques that made government effective. The ideology of restoration rule therefore fits inside the longer history of European state building in the name of public welfare and individual autonomy. Since the 18th century, rulers, ministers, jurists, economists, and police officials had spoken of public welfare, good order, fiscal justice, population, useful labor, moral discipline, roads, schools, poor relief, and regular administration. Habsburg officials could describe these aims through the language of Catholic monarchy, cameral science, Josephine reform, and the publico bene. Savoyard officials could fold them into an older military fiscal tradition of royal service, provincial command, and disciplined municipal life. Later liberals would attach many of the same instruments to constitutions: public opinion, national sovereignty, property rights, and legal equality. The line between restored monarchy and liberal government was therefore less clean at the level of administration than it appeared at the level of alleged political doctrine. Dynastic rulers rejected revolutionary sovereignty and mass political mobilization. They still claimed the right to reorder local life in the name of legality, welfare, efficiency, security, and improvement. Liberal states would later make similar claims with a different source of legitimacy. Both could treat autonomous communes, corporate privilege, clerical jurisdiction, customary exemptions, and local brokerage as obstacles to regular government. Seen from a Lombard or Venetian village, the sequence from French prefect to Austrian district captain to later Italian prefect appeared as cumulative pressure. Each regime used a different vocabulary of rule. Each regime claimed a different principle of rule, but each demanded papers, taxes, compliance, information, and men. The Restoration Order therefore formed a hybrid: dynastic in sovereignty, paternal in public language, 18th century in its reforming ambitions, Napoleonic in many of its instruments, and prefigurative of the liberal administrative state that later claimed the peninsula. This hybrid depended on local elites. Central government could appoint officials, issue circulars, and send police orders, yet villages were governed through men who knew property relations, kinship, credit, irrigation, feuds, reputations, religious influence, and household capacity. The notables, priests, clerks, guards, and municipal officers who made command intelligible also made it negotiable. The state needed them as translators and brokers. It watched them for the same reason. The Congress of Vienna redrew the Italian map without removing the administrative problem created across the previous century. Lombardy and Venetia became the Habsburg Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia. Piedmont Sardinia was restored and enlarged with Liguria. Parma, Modena, and Tuscany returned to Habsburg or Bourbon dynasties. The Papal States and the Two Sicilies were reconstituted. Dynastic legitimacy returned at the level of sovereignty, ceremony, and public law. The deeper problem remained: how to govern populations that had already been registered, taxed, conscripted, policed, mapped, and reorganized through reforming and Napoleonic methods. The restored rulers could denounce revolutionary sovereignty and imperial conquest. They could purge collaborators, revive court rituals, strengthen clerical authority, censor political writing and police associations. They could not govern well through memory alone. They needed revenue, public order, roads, courts, schools, police, military capacity, stable local accounts, and a chain of command that reached beyond provincial aristocracies and municipal corporations. The restored order therefore carried two inheritances at once: the language of legitimate monarchy and the administrative habits of the modernizing state. These habits had not begun with Napoleon. In Lombardy, Habsburg reform had already made land, wealth, clerical institutions, charities, schools, municipalities, and local accounts into objects of government. In Savoyard territories, the crown had long pressed against communal autonomy, provincial privilege, fiscal evasion, and intermediary powers through governors, intendants, courts, cadastral work, military obligations, and supervised councils. Napoleon accelerated these processes and gave them a harder imperial form. He did not invent the desire to make territory legible, taxable, obedient, and productive. The ideological language of restoration government drew from monarchy, Catholic order, public welfare, good police, legal regularity, and paternal care. It presented the ruler as guardian of peace, religion, property, hierarchy, and the common good. This was not a retreat from state ambition. It was a way of legitimating state ambition after revolution. The ruler claimed authority because he was lawful, hereditary, Christian, protective, and above faction. His officials claimed power because they brought order to accounts, roads, morals, schools, poor relief, land registers, police, and municipal conduct. This is where restoration rule overlapped with the liberal state that followed it. Liberal government would speak more loudly of rights, constitutions, public opinion, equality before the law, property, representation, and the nation. Yet the daily machinery of rule remained recognizable: files, districts, tax registers, cadastral maps, police intelligence, courts, school systems, public works, communal budgets, conscription lists, and appointed officials. The argument changed. The appetite for administrative reach did not disappear. The restoration regimes, therefore, should not be treated as a simple pause between Napoleon and national liberalism. They were part of the same long compression of local autonomy by central government. The restored dynasties placed that compression inside the language of order, religion, hierarchy, and public welfare. The Napoleonic state had placed it inside the language of conquest, code, merit, uniformity, and imperial necessity. The later liberal state would place it inside the language of nation, citizenship, legality, and progress. Villages and small towns encountered all three as demands made from above. For local society, the change after 1815 was real and limited at the same time. The flag changed. The sovereign changed. Some laws were repealed, some offices renamed, some political memories punished, some religious authorities strengthened. The communes still had to produce lists, collect taxes, help police the territory, report movement, manage roads, answer circulars, and mediate between households and the state. Local notables still carried authority because government needed their knowledge. Their position narrowed because government increasingly treated that knowledge as something to be inspected, corrected, and subordinated. The Restoration settlement therefore produced a layered political order. At the summit stood legitimate monarchy. Beneath it worked older 18th century reform: fiscal measurement, public welfare, ecclesiastical discipline, municipal supervision, and administrative regularity. Beneath that lay the Napoleonic experience of departments, prefectural command, conscription, police, codes, and military extraction. The pre-unification state was made from these layers. Liberalism later inherited more from them than it liked to admit. Lombardy entered the Restoration with a longer history of bureaucratic pressure than what Napoleonic rule alone can explain. It had already become one of the richest and most governable territories under Austrian rule, owing to its dense agriculture, commercial towns, ecclesiastical wealth, municipal institutions, noble property, and taxable surplus. From the 18th century, Vienna had worked to turn that wealth into usable fiscal and administrative capacity. The province was measured, classified, supervised, and drawn into a more disciplined relationship with the central state. The cadastre stood at the core of this older Habsburg project. Land had to be surveyed, valued, recorded, and made legible to the treasury. Fiscal government began with measurement. The tax burden could then be assigned with greater regularity, exemptions challenged, arrears pursued, and local privilege forced into written form. The cadastral map was an instrument of revenue and command. It converted fields, vineyards, woods, irrigation systems, farmsteads, and seigneurial claims into administrative knowledge. Local society encountered the state through assessors, surveyors, registers, appeals, and disputes over valuation. One account of pre-revolutionary Habsburg reforms notes taxation reaching as high as 42% of gross production. Maria Theresa supported some attempts at state intervention in the landlord-peasant relationship. By 1748, a new survey of the rustical land was completed and reissued in revised form in 1756. The state's financial needs placed a heavy burden on the peasantry, with taxation demanding up to 42% of their gross production. Only increasing agricultural productivity and a rising population, so the prevailing mercantilist and populationist logic ran, could possibly improve this picture. Following the revised cadastral survey, the state tried to improve the legal situation of the peasant, and especially to intervene if the landlord grossly mistreated his subjects or illegally transferred their land to his demesne, thereby removing it from taxation. Maria Theresa's reforms gave this process a durable institutional frame. Lombardy became a proving ground for a monarchy that wanted better accounts, more reliable provincial officials, a more regular tax base, and tighter control over the bodies that stood between crown and subject. Municipalities, aristocratic corporations, clerical institutions, charities, guilds, and provincial estates all came under closer scrutiny. Their privileges survived in varying degrees, and their local influence remained substantial. Their autonomy now had to operate under a government increasingly skilled at inspection, correspondence, audit, and correction. Josephine reform deepened the same pressure. Ecclesiastical property, seminaries, monasteries, schools, poor relief, marriage law, parish administration, and censorship all became fields of state concern. The Habsburg state did not see religion, charity, education, and local custom as matters outside government. It treated them as instruments of public order, moral discipline, and administrative reach. The priest, the municipal officer, the landowner, the teacher, and the police official all became part of a wider apparatus for governing conduct and extracting compliance. Lombard elites learned to operate inside this order. Nobles, lawyers, landowners, clerks, and municipal office holders supplied the knowledge without which government could not function. They knew property relations, irrigation rights, family alliances, credit networks, village quarrels, tax capacity, and the reputations of households. Vienna could appoint officials and issue instructions, and the province still had to be governed through men who understood the terrain. That dependence gave local elites room to bargain, delay, translate, and protect their own position. It also made them permanent targets of supervision. French rule after 1796 intensified an administrative formation already underway. The Napoleonic regime gave Lombardy departments, prefects, codes, conscription, gendarmes, and a sharper hierarchy of command. Milan rose in political status as the center of the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, and the province became one of the main platforms of imperial rule south of the Alps. The state's demands became heavier and more uniform. Men, taxes, roads, police intelligence, judicial records, and administrative reports moved through a grid designed for speed, discipline, and military utility. Napoleonic rule also changed the scale of state intrusion. Conscription entered households directly. The gendarmerie brought armed administrative presence into rural life. Codified law reduced the authority of local custom and older jurisdictional patchworks. Prefects and sub-prefects gave the center a clearer chain of transmission down to the commune. The commune itself became a lower unit of the state execution, responsible for records, lists, requisitions, policing assistance, and the enforcement of orders that often originated far beyond the district. The Austrian return in 1815 restored Habsburg sovereignty over a province already shaped by both Austrian reform and French command. Francis I proclaimed the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, joining Lombardy and Venetia under the imperial crown. The kingdom carried the appearance of a restored dynastic settlement. Its effective lines of authority ran upward to Vienna. Milan lost the political weight it had held under the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, and Venice regained no real independence. Both cities became major provincial centers inside an imperial system whose ministries, police authorities, and fiscal priorities lay beyond the region. The new regime removed much of the explicit Napoleonic political frame. It recast administration in dynastic, Catholic, imperial language. It distrusted revolutionary memory, liberal associations, secret societies, veterans networks, student circles, lawyers, journalists, and provincial elites too attached to the French period. Police surveillance, censorship, passport controls, informers, and restrictions on association became central instruments of government. The Restoration state wanted obedience, quiet, tax yield, and political demobilization. The administrative substance remained dense and intrusive. Vienna inherited a province already accustomed to cadastral record, bureaucratic correspondence, police reporting, and territorial supervision. Austrian officials brought back older Habsburg habits of cameral administration and Josephine oversight, then fused them with selected elements of the Napoleonic apparatus. The result was a colder, more imperial version of the centralized state. Its public language stressed legitimacy, order, paternal government, and loyalty to the dynasty. Its operating methods required files, inspections, police intelligence, fiscal registers, district command, and disciplined provincial reporting. At the village level, the regime appeared as continuous pressure from a distant center. The sovereign had changed, the uniforms had changed, and the political vocabulary had changed. The demands remained familiar: tax assessment, police cooperation, road obligations, military requirements, records of population and property, obedience to appointed officials, and caution before the written order. The commune still mattered because it held local knowledge. It also stood lower in the chain, increasingly treated as an administrative relay whose officers had to transmit orders downward and information upward. Lombard notables occupied a difficult position inside this system. Their cooperation was indispensable to the state since they mediated land, credit, office holding, charity, local discipline, and political intelligence. Their autonomy was suspect for the same reason. The Austrian administration needed them as brokers and watched them as potential conspirators. A landowner who could calm a village, deliver taxes, recommend officials, and identify troublemakers could also shield clients, obstruct investigations, and cultivate liberal opposition. The state therefore governed through the local elite and placed that elite under steady observation. The countryside carried its own forms of resistance and negotiation. Households disputed assessments, concealed resources, evaded obligations, used patrons, slowed compliance, and appealed through administrative channels. Smuggling, draft evasion, banditry, and local violence survived in the margins and along lines of movement. The police could gather intelligence, and it still needed guides, informers, priests, municipal clerks, landowners, and guards to convert suspicion into usable knowledge. Armed authority had reach. Local society controlled much of the information that made reach effective. Lombardy Venetia therefore emerged from the Restoration as a layered state formation. Beneath the restored dynasty lay the older Austrian program of fiscal measurement, ecclesiastical discipline, municipal supervision, and bureaucratic order. Beneath the Austrian Restoration lay the Napoleonic experience of departments, codes, prefectural command, conscription, and gendarmerie policing. The imperial government governed Lombardy through both inheritances. It stripped Milan of Napoleonic political centrality and kept much of the administrative depth that made the province valuable. The Habsburgs regime in Lombardy sought a quiet province, taxable, orderly, Catholic, loyal, and politically inert. Its own methods kept political tension alive. The more it demanded information, the more it empowered informers and intermediaries. The more it supervised notables, the more it confirmed their importance. The more it disciplined communes, the more local society learned the arts of paperwork, delay, appeal, and evasion. The state acquired administrative depth, and that depth created new points of friction. For Lombard villages and small towns, 1815 marked the re-entry of an older imperial master into an administrative landscape remade by war, reform, and French rule. Habsburg Lombardy became a province governed through cadastral, police, district command, clerical oversight, fiscal discipline, and elite brokerage. The regime restored monarchy at the summit and intensified bureaucracy beneath it. Victor Emmanuel's return to Savoy in 1814 restored dynasty, altar, and old legitimacy with deliberate force. French laws were abolished, older legal forms revived, clerical influence restored, and collaborators punished or pushed aside. The Restoration Court wanted a visible cleansing of the previous order. It treated the French period as usurpation, moral disorder, and political contamination. The measures had a symbolic value and satisfied constituencies that had suffered under annexation or detested revolutionary rule. They also reassured old elites that loyalty to the dynasty still carried rewards. The administrative problem remained. A monarchy that wished to govern effectively still needed tax yields, police intelligence, provincial discipline, road security, military capacity, and usable courts. The early Savoyard reaction restored older forms without removing the basic requirement for a strong center. The crown could purge men and repeal codes, yet it still had to rule a territory whose officials, lawyers, landowners, and communities had passed through 2 decades of denser administration. French rule had changed expectations as well as institutions. Subjects had learned habits of petition, appeal, evasion, bureaucratic procedure, and legal dispute. Officials had learned the power of registers, files, standard forms, and territorial supervision. Piedmont's Sardinia began the Restoration with an aggressive repudiation of French rule. Yet the Savoyard monarchy had been drawing on an older state tradition of its own. Long before annexation to France, Turin had pressed hard against communal autonomy, provincial privilege, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, feudal exemption, and local corporate life. Across the 18th century, the monarchy built itself as a military fiscal command state suspicious of intermediary powers, and accustomed to treating territory as a field for taxation, recruitment, policing, provisioning, and road control. The village was already being pulled into a chain of authority that ran through governors, intendants, courts, fiscal offices, military officers, and supervised communal councils. The intendant stood at the center of this older Savoyard system. He was the crown's provincial instrument for inspection, correction, and transmission. His work reached into communal accounts, tax assessment, public works, provisioning, police matters, disputes over local offices, and the conduct of municipal elites. The crown wanted fewer zones of customary immunity and fewer corporate bodies capable of sheltering their own affairs from scrutiny. Communal government survived, and village society retained formidable powers of obstruction, silence, evasion, and bargaining. The direction of travel was clear. Turin wanted local communities to become legible units of administration, fiscally accountable and politically subordinate. The Savoyard state historically had lived under demands of war, debt, fortification, diplomacy, and military readiness. It needed cash, grain, animals, roads, soldiers, and reliable information. Fiscal surveys and cadastral work allowed the government to assign burdens, challenge exemptions, pursue arrears, and expose local inequalities to central arbitration. Military obligation had the same effect. Recruitment and provisioning encouraged the state to know households, property, mobility, and local leadership. Roads served commerce and military movement at once. Police supervision protected revenue, secured communications, and reduced the autonomy of armed or semi-armed local actors. Communitarian life in Savoyard lands therefore already faced pressure before Napoleon arrived. Commons, forests, waters, grazing rights, confraternities, parishes, local charities, municipal offices, and village credit networks gave communities their own resources and command structures. These institutions allowed households to survive scarcity, manage risk, and resist outsiders. They also limited the crown's ability to extract men and money without negotiation. Savoyard reformers treated that local density as an administrative problem. They sought obedient communes, useful elites, predictable accounts, secure roads, controlled borders, and a countryside that could support the strategic requirements of the dynasty. Doing so led to the regime-crushing free village republics. French annexation recast this older Savoyard project in imperial form. The Napoleonic system let the regime exercise communal discipline, supervising of local elites, extracting revenue and men, and converting provincial society into an administrative field governed from the center. These processes, already underway even before Napoleon, gained sharper instruments and a more uniform language. Departments, prefects, sub-prefects, mayors, gendarmes, codes, conscription lists, cadastral surveys, and direct taxation made central command more regular and more intrusive. The French state reduced the space for local negotiation by turning the commune into a lower cell of an administrative hierarchy. It also drew heavily on Piedmontese habits of service, since the region already possessed trained officials, disciplined nobles, lawyers, soldiers, and provincial administrators accustomed to hierarchical rule. Local elites adjusted. Some entered the new order, served in councils, managed tax and conscription demands, and translated imperial commands into local practice. Others protected their position through delay, evasion, or double dealing. Peasant households and small tenants faced the imperial state through conscription, taxation, requisitions, police controls, and the disruption of older communal protections. The French regime enlarged the state's reach, while also exposing how much that reach depended on the same local brokers, informers, clerks, priests, landholders, and municipal figures it claimed to subordinate. Historical Savoyard policy therefore encouraged adoption of French institutions. Codified law returned as a practical necessity. Provincial supervision became stronger. Police authority became more systematic. Fiscal administration became more regular. The relationship between center and locality became more disciplined. The monarchy adopted useful parts of the French inheritance without presenting them as French. It folded them into an older dynastic tradition of command and gave them a Piedmontese political purpose. Piedmont's later leadership in the Italian national project cannot be understood as a simple liberal awakening. The state that eventually produced the Statuto, codified law, parliamentary reforms, and national war simply carried forward a deeper Savoyard inheritance. Suspicion of autonomous local bodies, reliance on appointed provincial authority, preference for disciplined administration, and a soldierly conception of public order. The constitutional monarchy that emerged under Charles Albert and his successors rested on an administrative formation built from several layers. 18th century Savoyard centralism, Napoleonic rationalization, restoration police control, and later liberal reform. Villages and small towns faced increasingly narrowing local room for maneuver. Communes retained influence because the state still needed loyal clerks, priests, landholders, guides, guards, and household knowledge. That reliance gave local society bargaining power, while also making it a permanent target of supervision. Piedmont Sardinia entered the Restoration as a reactionary monarchy, but its governing instincts were those of a centralizing command state with a long memory and an expanding administrative reach. The central duchies and Tuscany followed a more varied path than Lombardy, Venetia, or Piedmont, Sardinia. Modena treated much of the French legacy as a political danger and moved sharply to cleanse administration, law, and public life of revolutionary connotations. Parma and Tuscany, however, preserved their legal and administrative inheritance because those instruments made government regular, fiscally useful, and easier to supervise. Tuscany especially combined a milder public regime with a long tradition of centralized reform, legal regularity, police oversight, and restricted political participation. Its government rested on dynastic authority, paternal care, administrative improvement, and the management of public order. Tuscany's restoration cannot be understood as a return to a sealed ancient regime. The Grand Duchy already carried a deep inheritance of reform from the 18th century. Leopoldine government had treated taxation, landholding, roads, courts, grain policy, poor relief, ecclesiastical property, policing, and municipal conduct as proper fields of sovereign intervention. The ruler's authority was presented through moderation, public utility, fiscal fairness, legal reform, and concern for the welfare of subjects. This ideological language survived the Restoration. It gave centralization a softer tone than in Lombardy Venetia, while still keeping political initiative in the hands of the dynasty and its officials. The Tuscan state therefore joined paternal monarchy to administrative rationality. It did not need to borrow its whole governing logic from the French period. Earlier reform had already accustomed officials to thinking of society as something to be measured, corrected, encouraged, and disciplined through law and administration. The Napoleonic years sharpened that inheritance by strengthening territorial command, legal uniformity, fiscal pressure, and police procedure. After 1815, the restored Grand Duchy could distance itself from revolutionary sovereignty while retaining methods that served taxation, order, roads, courts, schools, and provincial supervision. The same pattern appeared across the central duchies in different proportions. Modena leaned more heavily on repression, court loyalty, police suspicion, and political purification. Parma and Tuscany showed greater willingness to preserve practical parts of the French administrative settlement. None of these regimes opened broad participation. Their ideological world remained dynastic, hierarchical, and paternal. Yet their statecraft belonged to the same wider European repertoire that later liberal governments would use. Regular law, written procedure, fiscal legibility, supervised municipalities, police knowledge, public works, and appointed provincial authority. The prefectural model shows the depth of this institutional survival. Titles changed, jurisdictions shifted, and each dynasty clothed the office in its own political vocabulary. The core function endured. A centrally appointed officer stood between the capital and the localities, supervising provinces, communes, police, taxation, roads, public order, and implementation. Whether called prefect, governor, delegate, intendant, or district captain, this figure embodied a common principle. The center required an agent who could transmit orders downward, collect information upward, discipline local authorities, and keep the commune inside a wider chain of command. This office joined ideology to technique. The provincial officer represented the ruler's care, justice, vigilance, and protection. He also represented the archive, the police report, the tax register, the circular, the inspection, and the written reprimand. Dynastic government used him to make paternal authority operational. Napoleonic government had used comparable officers to make imperial command uniform. Liberal government would later use the prefect to make national sovereignty present in the province. The same administrative form could serve different claims about legitimacy. The restored regimes therefore lived inside a layered political formation. They wanted monarchy, religion, hierarchy, local deference, and historical right. They also wanted the capacity created by 18th century reform, revolutionary law, and Napoleonic centralization. Their public language spoke of order, welfare, morality, obedience, and legitimate authority. Their operating methods relied on files, maps, lists, reports, inspectors, police, courts, tax offices, and appointed agents. The ideological distance between Restoration monarchy and later liberal statehood was real at the level of sovereignty and political participation. At the level of daily rule, the overlap was deep. In Lombardy Venetia, this produced an imperial system of censorship, police surveillance, association control, fiscal rationalization, cadastral discipline, and conscription management. In Piedmont Sardinia, the early Restoration reaction generated opposition among nobles, officers, lawyers, and bourgeois families who had learned to operate inside a more regular legal and administrative order. Under Charles Albert, the monarchy converted parts of this inheritance into a controlled constitutional project. Codified law, the reformed administration, the army, the courts, and the Statute of 1848 emerged from an older state tradition already committed to central command. From the village level, regime change often looked like redeployment. The insignia changed, the sovereign changed, and the rhetoric changed. The demands continued. Taxes, registers, police cooperation, military obligation, road controls, judicial discipline, school oversight, and paper compliance. Restoration rule did not abolish the encroaching state. It reflagged it, moralized it, placed it under dynastic command, and justified it through welfare, order, religion, and legitimate authority. In doing so, it preserved much of the machinery that later liberal governments would inherit, nationalize, and expand. If 18th century reform, Napoleonic rule, and Restoration governments supplied the machinery for a more intrusive state, local notabili supplied the working connection between command and village life. Many of the same men and families had already served under French rule. They had sat on municipal councils, acted as mayors, assessed taxes, handled requisitions, judged minor disputes, managed police information, and helped produce the lists through which the commune became legible. Restoration governments could change titles, purge some personnel, revive older ceremonies, and recast public language in dynastic and paternal terms. They still needed men who knew who owned which field, which household could pay, which family was protected by which patron, which tenant was likely to disappear before conscription, which road needed repair, which priest had influence, and which quarrel could become disorder. The state could send prefects, governors, delegates, intendants, district captains, police officials, and fiscal inspectors. It could issue circulars from Milan, Venice, Turin, Florence, Parma, or Modena. It could demand reports, lists, accounts, and compliance. It could not govern every village by direct command. Administration became effective only when local knowledge passed through municipal officers, clerks, priests, landholders, guards, informers, doctors, lawyers, and notaries. It was, however, the local elite who decided to finance a particular industry, develop a scientific culture, or invest in new machinery. As members of the provincial assemblies or congregazioni and of the chambers of commerce, they could sponsor a range of projects. Examination of the structure of Venetia and Lombardy prior to Italian unity helps us to understand whether elites played an active role in this period of transformation. Lombardy and Venetia show how much the regime depended on the composition of these elites. Both regions belonged to the same Habsburg kingdom. Both faced the same imperial ministries, police habits, fiscal structures, and administrative vocabulary. Their local notabili behaved differently. In Lombardy, urban bourgeois, professionals, commercially minded nobles, engineers, bankers, agricultural improvers, and municipal administrators used official institutions to support technical education, infrastructure, agricultural experimentation, irrigation management, silk improvement, credit, and learned societies. In Venetia, a more patrician and rentier-oriented elite often used office to defend status, land income, family standing, and social quiet. The difference was visible inside councils, chambers of commerce, academies, charitable bodies, schools, provincial organs, and municipal administration. A commune or province did not receive state policy as a blank surface. It received policy through men with interests, alliances, habits, and fears. The same decree could become investment, delay, evasion, patronage, resistance, or routine compliance, depending on who controlled the local passage from paper to practice. The hybrid order therefore rested on three levels of command. At the top stood dynastic governments, ministries, councils, courts, police authorities, and fiscal offices. They produced budgets, codes, circulars, surveillance instructions, tax rules, recruitment demands, school regulations, and public works orders. In the middle stood provincial officers, often descended from or adapted to Napoleonic models who turned central policy into pressure on communes. At the bottom stood municipal councils and village authorities, dominated by notabili who translated orders into local action. This arrangement gave notabili real power. They could soften a tax demand, guide an appeal, warn a household, recommend a clerk, protect a client, influence evaluation, slow a report, frame a police suspicion, or make a road obligation fall more heavily on one group than another. They could also deliver the village to the state. They signed conscription lists, supervised tax rolls, reported absences, certified property, helped police mobility, judged disputes, distributed burdens, and turned household knowledge into administrative fact. Their authority was therefore double-edged. To villagers, they could appear as patrons, protectors, negotiators, creditors, employers, benefactors, and spokesmen. To the state, they appeared as useful intermediaries, local experts, fiscal guarantors, police informants, and administrative auxiliaries. The same man who shielded a neighbor from a harsh demand could also place that neighbor's son on a military list. The same council that defended communal interest against Vienna, Turin, or Florence could impose the tax, requisition, road labor, school rule, or police order that made central power real. This brokerage tied local society more tightly to the state. It also kept local negotiation alive. The center gained reach through the notabili. The notabili gained leverage through their indispensability. Villagers learned to work through patrons, clerks, petitions, certificates, delays, silence, and selective compliance. Restoration administration therefore did not flatten local society into obedience. It bound village life to a thicker chain of paperwork, office holding, surveillance, fiscal assessment, and elite mediation. The local elite became the hinge of the pre-unification hybrid order. Dynastic sovereignty stood above. Modern administration pressed downward. Communal knowledge moved upward through men whose position depended on both sides. That hinge made the state stronger, and it also made state power uneven, negotiated, personal, and vulnerable to local interests. The hybrid system generated chronic low-level conflict between centralizing governments and village communities. The major Risorgimento uprisings of 1820-21, 1831, and 1848 were only the visible peaks. Beneath them sat ordinary struggles over tax assessments, land registers, recruitment, policing, roads, courts, exemptions, and the written obligations that entered rural life through the commune. Cadastres were among the most sensitive instruments of this pressure. Napoleonic and Austrian reforms had introduced, revised, or expanded land registers in parts of northern Italy, and these registers carried two meanings at once. They promised a more regular fiscal order by recording property, classifying land, and limiting the room for aristocratic privilege, clerical exemption, and informal evasion. They also threatened to expose hidden holdings, revalue fields, fix disputed rights in writing, and lock households into heavier burdens. Measurement could look like justice from above and danger from below. The problem survived into unification. By 1861, the Italian states possessed 24 different land registers, each built from different legal traditions, survey methods, fiscal categories, and regional histories. This made the national state's fiscal consolidation harder from the start. Cadastres were among the most sensitive instruments of this pressure. Napoleonic and Austrian reforms had introduced, revised, or expanded land registers in parts of northern Italy, and these registers carried two meanings at once. They promised a more regular fiscal order by recording property, classifying land, and limiting the room for aristocratic privilege, clerical exemption, and informal evasion. They also threatened to expose hidden holdings, revalue fields, fix disputed rights in writing, and lock households into heavier burdens. Measurement could look like justice from above and danger from below. The fiscal problem did not disappear once land was measured. A cadastre could claim technical neutrality while distributing burdens unevenly across owners, plots, crops, regions, and productivity classes. Modern work on the Italian land cadastre makes the point clearly, even for a later period, when comparing the market prices of land with the same cadastral tariffs, which are thus matched by identical taxable income. The considerable magnitude of the variations in the prices paid highlights the unequal treatment in which landowners incur. This occurs because of the marked differences in the market prices of the respective land assets. Now that later evidence does not prove what a Lombard or Venetian villager experienced in 1815 or 1848, it does show the enduring fiscal problem built into cadastral government. The state translated land into taxable categories, then treated those categories as if they were stable, fair, and technically objective. Local society knew better. A field's value was never just a number. It affected taxes, rents, credit, inheritance, dowries, exemptions, family survival, and the balance between larger proprietors and smaller cultivators. Once written into a register, a contested valuation could harden into administrative fact. Northern peasant communities encountered cadastral surveys as incursions into local definitions of property burden and status. A field's value affected taxes, rents, credit, inheritance, dowry calculations, communal standing, and the balance between large proprietors and small cultivators. In the wider Habsburg monarchy, revised surveys and fiscal reform could place heavy pressure on peasant producers. Cadastral politics therefore unfolded inside village society as well as between village and state. Landowning elites entered municipal councils, fiscal commissions, and local offices, placing themselves near the procedures that classified land and distributed burdens. Larger proprietors could present themselves as defenders of communal interests against excessive valuation. They could also use their literacy, office holding, and connections to protect their own estates and shift weight onto poorer neighbors. From the village side, cadastral disputes revolved around survival, fairness, and influence. Poorer cultivators relied on local notabili to press for lower valuations, obtain relief after bad harvests, defend marginal land from aggressive classification, or guide appeals through unfamiliar paperwork. The same notabili could exploit the same machinery. A valuation once written into the register could turn a local hierarchy into an administrative fact. Conscription created another line of conflict. The Restoration state spoke in the language of general obligation, public service, and military necessity. Village society answered through household economy, inheritance, labor scarcity, patronage, and the fear of losing sons for years. In Lombardy, Venetia, taxation and conscription were major burdens of Austrian rule, and the Habsburg system had to balance inherited Napoleonic machinery with imperial efforts to make administration more uniform. In Venetia, conscription connected the army, the police, and the commune. Eligible men had to be identified, registered, tracked, exempted, selected, or pursued. Movement mattered because the men who left the village could become harder to count. Petitions mattered because exemptions had to be argued in the language of family need, health, labor, and local indispensability. Policing mattered because desertion, vagrancy, forged papers, and temporary flight turned military administration into a problem of everyday surveillance. Work on Habsburg Venetia has also stressed that Austrian policing was constrained by underfunding, limited manpower, and dependence on information gathered through local channels. Piedmont and the other dynastic states faced similar tensions. Conscription could feed liberal and national agitation through Carbonari networks, military circles, student groups, and the crisis years around 1848. Outside open revolt, communities fought the levy through quieter means. Families bargained, appealed, hid sons, arranged substitutes, exploited medical categories, manipulated residents, used patrons, and turned paperwork into a field of negotiation. The state demanded men in abstract categories. Villages answered through named households. Here again, local notabili stood at the hinge. They kept registers, certified family circumstances, presided over communal procedures, knew which sons mattered to which farms, and could favor one household over another. Their discretion gave the military system its local form. A substitute could be accepted, an absence explained, a young man classified as indispensable, a petition strengthened, a delay tolerated, or a poor household left exposed. Conscription made central power visible in the body of the recruit. Local mediation decided how that visibility fell across the village. Public order was the third field of everyday conflict. Theft, assault, quarrels, grazing disputes, poaching, smuggling, debt conflicts, domestic violence, factional insults, tavern fights, and small-scale banditry placed the state inside ordinary rural life. Habsburg Venetia had gendarmes, courts, police officials, and administrative reporting, yet direct control remained limited. The Venetian constabulary after 1814 was often underfunded and ill-suited to crime prevention, while higher police officials also gathered information for government and watched other branches of the bureaucracy. Public order therefore depended on cooperation between village and state. Village authorities and notabili could report an incident, soften it, delay it, bury it, or reframe it as a private quarrel. Rural households often preferred informal settlement over formal prosecution, especially when kinship, debt, tenancy, or patronage tied the parties together. Guards, retainers, armed clients, estate agents, smugglers, and local toughs could keep order in one moment and break it in another. The line between protection and intimidation remained thin. This pattern was not confined to the Habsburg provinces. 19th century Italy carried a dense mixture of public authority and private power, with formal policing operating beside landlord discipline, clientage, family alliances, vendetta, charitable dependence, estate guards, and municipal influence. Davis's work on law and order treats crime, police, social hierarchy, and state consolidation as connected problems across the peninsula, with public authority repeatedly forced to work through private power rather than simply replacing it. In the northern countryside, this produced selective enforcement. Village feuds and factional alignments could be tolerated so long as they stayed local and did not threaten roads, taxes, recruitment, property, or political calm. A criminal code might claim universal application, while its practical use depended on who was involved, who had patrons, who could mobilize witnesses, who controlled the municipal council, and how much trouble the provincial officer wanted to invite. Police authority did not descend evenly. It moved through reputation, paperwork, fear, discretion, and local bargaining. A gray zone opened between official and unofficial order. Bravi, retainers, rural guards, estate agents, emerging Carabinieri, gendarmes, municipal officers, priests, and landowners all participated in keeping peace and disturbing it. A quarrel might become a criminal case, a mediated settlement, an act of revenge, a police report, or an administrative warning. The decision rarely belonged to the code alone. Local society thus saw the encroaching state acting uneven and personal. Its language of law, taxation, service order, public welfare, and security sought universal ends. Its local operations passed through men, files, exemptions, favors, threats, kinship, landholding, and municipal office. The register may have been uniform, but the commune were not. By 1860, northern Italy already knew the centralized bureaucratic state. Its regimes were dynastic, participation was narrow, and political language still rested on monarchy, order, religion, and public welfare. The machinery beneath that language ran on communes, prefectural or district supervision, police reports, cadastral courts, conscription lists, tax registers, and written appeals. Local communities learned to live inside that machinery. They used notabili as shields, pushed municipal councils to resist new burdens, asked patrons to secure relief, and exploited rivalries among local elites. They evaded where they could, underreporting land, delaying payments, hiding sons from military lists, settling quarrels privately, and keeping disputes away from courts when formal law threatened local balance. They also used the state when it suited them. A household, faction, or commune could appeal upward to Vienna, Turin, Florence, or a provincial office against a local enemy. Restoration governments learned the same lesson from the other side. Centralized administration was indispensable, but it could not function by decree alone. The state project that absorbed northern Italy had taken shape in the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont between 1848 and 1859. It then extended to Lombardy, the Venetian mainland, Emilia-Romagna, and the rest of the peninsula. Piedmont's Statuto Albertino of 1848 became the constitution of the new Kingdom of Italy, and Piedmont's administrative and security apparatus followed. The basic legal and policing framework of liberal Italy was created in a compressed centralizing moment between 1859 and 1865, under emergency powers granted to the Piedmontese government in wartime. The new Civil Code of 1865, the Public Security Law of the same year, and the surrounding criminal procedures descended as a block from a small circle of Piedmontese jurists and ministers, operating under conditions closer to a state of siege than to the classical liberal ideal of deliberative legislation. The Po Valley's communes and provinces produced no slow negotiated settlement of their own. The Statuto located executive power at the top. The throne of Italy and the constitutional representative monarchy are by the grace of God and the will of the nation hereditary in the House of Savoy. The executive power belongs to the king alone. He is the supreme head of the state. He commands all the land and sea forces. He declares war. He concludes treaties of peace, alliance of commerce, and others, informing the chambers thereof as soon as the interest and security of the state permit. From the Statuto Albertino, 1848, Articles 2 and 5. Liberal Italy was therefore not a framework of rights resting on local liberty. Its constitution began from royal executive command. Parliament met, civil equality was proclaimed, statutes and codes accumulated, but the working form of the state was vertical. The Administrative Unification Law of 1865 carried this structure into the provinces. It divided the kingdom into provinces, districts, mandamenti, and communes, but these names preserved no self-rule. The prefect was the instrument by which the center acted in each province. The prefect represents the executive power throughout the whole province. He provides for the publication and execution of the laws. He watches over the conduct of all public administrations, and in case of urgent necessity gives the orders he judges indispensable. He has supervision of public security. He has the right to dispose of the public force and to requisition the armed force. He depends on the Minister of the Interior and executes his instructions. From the Legge Comunale e Provinciale, in Gazzetta Ufficiale del Regno d'Italia, 27 April 1865, Article 3. The same statute placed the head of the commune inside that chain. The appointment of the mayor is made by the king, by decree countersigned by the Minister of the Interior from among the communal councillors, and he holds office for 3 years. From the Legge Comunale e Provinciale, Article 98. The commune remained a unit of paperwork, taxation, recruitment, and local implementation, but the legal chain ran upward to prefect, minister, king, and state. A law had been enacted guaranteeing administrative unification across all the territories acquired by the Kingdom of Sardinia in the previous years. This law was extended with some modifications to the Veneto at the end of 1866. The administrative structure that resulted from these changes was inspired by a centralist and hierarchical model, with a mayor appointed by the king and a prefect holding broad powers who reported directly to the government. Lombardy and Emilia, with their long municipal traditions, found their councils supervised and overridden by officials whose first loyalty lay with the Interior Ministry. The Public Security Law of 1865 completed the structure in police form. Responsibility for public order was centralized under the Interior Ministry, the prefects and sub-prefects, and the Royal Carabinieri. The Italian Carabinieri originated in Piedmont and were inherited by liberal Italy. They had developed a prestigious reputation as defenders of the Savoyard monarchy and as combatants in the wars of the Risorgimento, like the Gendarmeria of Napoleonic Italy, in whose image they had been created. The Carabinieri were charged simultaneously with the establishment of a new political order and the preservation of the social status quo. The fact that the Guardia di Pubblica Sicurezza, liberal Italy's fledgling civilian police force, was small and confined within urban districts ensured that the Carabinieri assumed the greatest responsibility for policing. This was especially the case in the vast and hazardous rural areas, where the authority of the state was under greatest threat. Civilian police therefore remained small and mostly urban. In the rural zones of Piedmont, Lombardy, the Veneto, and Emilia, the black uniformed Carabinieri patrols represented the state. The law gave their officers a mandate that ran ahead of any crime. Assembly fell under the same administrative command. A gathering could be ordered to disperse, and refusal brought force after formal warning. Coercion was regularized under this regime rather than abolished. Local notables, lawyers, landowners, mayors, clerks, and police auxiliaries were drawn into a centralized system that needed village knowledge while refusing village jurisdiction. The codes of 1865 extended the same logic into everyday life. Customary practices in the northern countryside, gathering wood, fruit, and nuts in the forests, gleaning in the fields, settling quarrels by informal arbitration, had lived in a gray zone of tolerated behavior. The new civil and criminal codes made them prosecutable offenses as theft or damage to property. Piemontesizzazione therefore extended beyond the outward spread of Piedmontese statutes. Lombard municipal habits, Venetian forest uses, Emilian communal traditions, parish authority, usi civici, and informal arbitration were no longer recognized as independent sources of law. They could be tolerated only as they could be translated into the state's code, register, permit, tax roll, summons, or police report. Many inhabitants of the annexed territories felt that they had been conquered by the Piedmontese rather than united with them as equals. In the northern countryside, the choice meant a state that leaned on local notabili lawyers, landowners, and professionals, while disciplining the small proprietors and sharecroppers whose lives the new laws most directly reached. Liberal Italy's law and order offensive was therefore anti-local and anti-communal from the start, and dissolved plural jurisdictions into a single sovereign legal order in the name of equality. Once the Piedmontese legal administrative bloc had been transplanted, the state reached into the northern countryside through a small set of intrusive instruments: fiscal extraction, conscription, the courts, and a militarized public security regime. Each converted a local relationship into a direct impersonal claim by the center. Direct land tax remained the backbone of state finance, supplemented by duties on salt, flour, and other consumption goods. In Lombardy Veneto, the unified state inherited the Austrian cadastral, among the most advanced in Europe, and used it to drive a rationalized, centralized land tax. Forest law and taxation ran together. In the Veneto, the administration levied an 8% charge on the value of timber for every felling in public woodlands bonan. For small proprietors and sharecroppers in the Po Valley, obligations once mediated by landlords, communes, or tax farmers now arrived as uniform claims backed by Carabinieri and courts. Municipal councils still handled the reparto, the apportionment of quotas among households, but under demands fixed in Turin and Rome. The notables who sat on those councils defended their own classes' exemptions, bargained with prefects over arrears, and pressed land and consumption taxes onto their neighbors. Resistance to tax collectors and cadastral officers became one of the earliest forms of rural protest under the new regime. With a tax on bailiffs and registry offices concentrated in the Veneto, Lombardy and Piedmont, where small property and strong communal identities ran deep, conscription supplied another equally tangible claim. Post-unification legislation turned the Piedmontese recruitment system into a national regime that extended in stages to all male citizens. For peasant proprietors in the irrigated Lombard Plain or the maize districts of the Veneto, the removal of sons for years of service threatened the labor balance on which family farming depended. Substitution and desertion blunted the law without erasing it, and communities answered with a mix of evasion and moral argument. Conscription was denounced as the confiscation of manpower by a remote state, with civic duty rarely entering the protest at all. The codes of 1865 then drove central economic doctrine into the daily working of rural life. In forestry, proposals for a unified code stalled for years in deference to property rights. When a law finally passed in 1877, it restricted high-altitude felling for hydrogeological reasons, but kept a liberal reluctance to accept rules limiting property. The burden of protection, limits on cutting and grazing, fell on upland communities, while large lowland proprietors stayed free to exploit their land. The state legislated in the name of the general interest, and smallholders bore the cost. Public security wrapped these intrusions in a daily regime of surveillance and force. The 1865 law granted broad powers of surveillance, preventive arrest, and internal banishment. Insults to officials drew imprisonment. Meetings and newspapers could be restricted by administrative order rather than judicial sentence. The Carabinieri, under military discipline, sat at the center of the system, especially in rural areas where the civilian Guardia di Pubblica Sicurezza barely existed. They patrolled the vast and hazardous rural zones, where the authority of the state was most exposed, and as agents of a government many regarded as illegitimate, they earned a reputation as instruments of repression. Tax, conscription, codes, and gendarmerie together redefined long-standing practice as illegal, extracted money and bodies at a new scale, and placed local communities under a security regime whose priorities were set elsewhere. Northern rural society did not accept this quietly. Smallholders, sharecroppers, village elites, and professional notabili moved between open defiance, quiet evasion, and strategic collaboration. That mixture, neither consent nor pure coercion, gave the liberal state its actual hold on the countryside. Tax and conscription produced the clearest clashes. In Lombardy, the Veneto and Piedmont villagers obstructed cadastral surveys, refused information, and at times attacked surveyors and registry offices, reviving the targets of the revolutionary era now in the name of resisting the Piedmontese rather than the Austrians. Conscription evasion became a collective craft. Families tampered with civil registers, arranged clandestine emigration, or pooled money for substitutes, sometimes with the quiet help of mayors and parish priests. The state read these acts as criminal or subversive. Villagers framed them as defense of household survival against an arbitrary demand. Petitions often combined deference to the king with hostility to his ministers, the classic tactic of protesting in the name of a higher authority against the local agents of the same state. Forests and commons followed the same pattern. In the Veneto, post-1866 royal commissioners kept the Napoleonic Austrian forest rules and tried to fix woodland extent through statistical reports, while populations dependent on coppice and wooded pasture for grazing, fuel, and fodder faced a tightening net of permits, taxes, and restrictions. Forest agents sometimes inflated woodland surface to magnify their own importance, and there ran a standing conflict of interest between administrators and users. Villagers responded with illicit felling, clandestine grazing, and the occasional open confrontation with guards. From below, the rules threatened long-standing usi civici. From above, the same acts were abuse or criminal damage. Taxes also drew on deeper grievances against the state itself, rooted in the long quarrel between the liberal kingdom and the church, which gave fiscal evasion a moral coloring rather than a merely self-interested one. The success of Protestant states such as Prussia or the Netherlands led to an emulation of disciplinary revolutions in Catholic countries during the Counter-Reformation. However, these were arguably bound to fail, due to the softer take of Catholicism on discipline and inner-worldly asceticism. In Catholicism, it is not discipline but doing good works that brings you closer to heaven. Donations and alms should go to civil society or church charities, not to the state. Furthermore, the Catholic sinner has the possibility to repent or to buy indulgences. Hence, being not entirely accurate on one's tax declaration can be corrected through paying alms or confessing. In northern dioceses where parish networks structured daily life, villagers who had once rallied against Austrian or ducal rule under the banner of national independence came to see the unified state as hostile both to their economic interests and to their religious institutions, especially after the suppression and confiscation of church property. Withholding tax and understating property turned into gestures against a state perceived as unjust. The notabili worked the middle ground. The same lawyers, landowners, and professionals who sat on municipal councils, managed estates, and led charities served at once as brokers for the state and as defenders of local society. As aristocratic landlords lost their grip, peasant proprietors increasingly looked to small-town notables from the professional classes for leadership. Littleton. These men helped villagers through the new codes, represented them in tax disputes, and mobilized political contacts in Turin, Florence, or Rome. They also used the new institutions to entrench themselves. Prefects relied on them to execute central directives, and they treated municipal offices, contracts, and honors as resources for kin and clients. They negotiated down the taxes of allies, secured exemptions from conscription, and mediated conflicts over commons, while leaving marginal groups exposed to the full weight of the law. The state's authority in the northern countryside therefore filtered through a chain of bargains and small conflicts, ruling neither by force alone nor by anything resembling consent. If tax offices and courts embodied the fiscal and legal sides of encroachment, Carabinieri barracks and army detachments embodied its security side, and here the gap between liberal constitutional rhetoric and authoritarian practice was widest. The 1865 Public Safety Law on rights reading marked the return to absolutist methods in policing. The police could arrest on suspicion, impose internal exile, and restrict press and assembly by administrative authority, well past anything the Statuto might have led a liberal theorist to expect. Foreign observers felt it directly. After 2 Britons were arrested and humiliated by Carabinieri in one notorious incident, with the local mayor and magistrate refusing to intervene, the imprisoned traveler concluded that he had been shown a specimen of the affronts to which a gentleman was exposed under the regime, right. In the northern countryside, the Corps' double mission, build a new political order and preserve the social one, took on a class function. Patrols targeted the conduct of the poor, vagrancy, begging, wood theft, poaching, grain pilfering, outrage against officials. Law, order, and public morality were the governing values of elites, and a broad range of misfits like beggars, vagrants, prostitutes, and petty thieves were swept into arrest and imprisonment. The rural working poor of the Po Valley met the state less as a guarantor of rights than as a standing threat of intervention should they disturb property relations or public order. The apparatus depended on local elites to function. The forces responsible for order in liberal Italy were divided, understrengthed, and disorganized, and they compensated through alliance with a powerful judiciary and with local allies. In the countryside, those allies were landowners, large tenants, and notabili. Carabinieri posts needed to know who in a village made trouble. Prefects needed reliable mayors to report on mood and mobilization. Judges needed trusted intermediaries to supply testimony. The result was a co-produced security state. The government supplied codes, officers, and barracks. Local notables supplied intelligence, legitimacy, and informal enforcement. The arrangement showed itself plainly as agrarian conflict sharpened. In the plains of Emilia and Lombardy, capitalist agriculture expanded through large, market-oriented farms worked by sharecroppers and wage labor, Littleton. As Catholic leagues and socialist societies formed in the 1880s and 1890s, landowners and estate managers turned to prefects and Carabinieri for protection. Strikes and rent disputes brought troops, the arrest of organizers, and local states of siege. A public security law first justified by brigandage and political violence furnished the legal tools to break rural leagues and cooperatives in the north. On paper, every citizen held equal civil rights under the Statuto and the codes. In practice, emergency-style security law, a politically dependent judiciary, and a gendarmerie embedded in local patronage produced sharply unequal enforcement. A strike leader in the Pole Scene or the Bolognese could be handled as a public danger, while a landlord who evaded tax or breached forest rules could often count on discreet accommodation from prefect and magistrate. The net effect was double-edged. The regime pushed the state deeper into northern villages and farmsteads than any predecessor had managed, and at the same time, it entrenched the state's dependence on local alliances and local knowledge, preserving the embedded, particularistic structures that liberal universalism claimed to dissolve. By the 1890s, the conflict had hardened into a durable form. New burdens and criminalized old practices on one side, learned repertoires of evasion, protest, and petition on the other, notabili lodged as indispensable brokers in between, and a security apparatus more centralized than anything before it, yet still tangled in local power. From this configuration came both the later Third Italy of districts and cooperatives and the authoritarian turn of the early 20th century, a state liberal in form and built on accommodations with the very particularisms it claimed to supersede. By the close of the 19th century, the conflict had moved onto the ground of industrialization and municipal politics. The northern provinces that had endured Napoleonic conscription and Piedmontese tax reform now entered a concentrated wave of factory growth, railway construction, and market integration. Yet the new economy did not dissolve older local solidarities, it attached itself to them. Provincial industrialization was uneven. Wool and cotton mills appeared where rivers dropped steeply enough to supply power. Later, steam and electricity loosened that dependence. Manufacturing began to move down from upland valleys toward the plains, closer to railway junctions, markets, and larger pools of labor. By century's turn, those earlier vertical mills had given way to larger horizontal factories on the edges of the plains. Industry thickened around Milan and Turin, but also around Sesto San Giovanni, Biella, Schio, Prato, and smaller centers in the Veneto and Emilia. Each place industrialized through its own municipal traditions, chambers of commerce, local notables, and associational life. Sesto San Giovanni, just outside Milan, shows the pattern clearly. Metalworking and engineering plants multiplied. Workers' clubs, Catholic mutual aid societies, socialist circles, and local political associations took root. Municipal politics became the arena in which they fought. Catholic and socialist mobilization did not grow from abstract doctrine alone. Both drew strength from meanings already attached to the town, the neighborhood, the parish, and the workplace. Industry created new social layers: factory owners, technicians, clerks, skilled workers, organizers, and municipal professionals. But it did not erase village and town solidarities. Business associations, peasant leagues, Catholic mutual aid societies, socialist clubs, and workers' organizations anchored themselves in those solidarities and used municipal institutions as their political hinge. Cooperation offered another local route into modern capitalism. The early Italian cooperatives were not abstract socialist experiments. They were practical survival devices. They were formed to help weaker social groups cope with the shocks of the market economy through self-help and mutual aid. In the north, this meant rural consumer cooperatives tied to Po Valley sharecroppers, workers' production cooperatives in craft centers, and mutual credit in small towns. Luigi Luzzatti's People's Banks, founded from the 1860s, adapted German cooperative credit to Italian conditions. They relied on limited liability and character-based lending, so artisans and small farmers could borrow from local institutions rather than from usurers or large banks. These institutions stayed rooted in place. Their boards came from local elites. Their membership overlapped with parish networks, party circles, kinship ties, and occupational communities. Their balance sheets rose and fell with particular districts. By 1900, the northern landscape no longer resembled the fragmented, noble-dominated countryside of the early century. Small and medium towns had become hubs of factory work and cooperative capitalism. Within them, new elites straddled economic and political roles. Industrialists sat on municipal councils. Cooperative leaders dealt directly with prefects. Lawyers served at once as parliamentary deputies and presidents of provincial credit institutions. The conflict between liberal universalism and local particularism no longer stood at the edge of the legal order. It ran through the heart of municipal government. Liberal Italy remained centralized on paper. Prefects carried the will of Rome into the provinces. Uniform codes applied from the Alps to Sicily. Elected councils worked under the eye of the Interior Ministry. Yet between 1880 and 1914, municipal autonomy expanded precisely where industrialization and social conflict were sharpest. The center delegated urban modernization to local government, and northern municipalities used that delegation to build their own versions of liberalism. The Giulittian period shows the mechanism. National governments between 1900 and 1914 passed social reforms in response to working class agitation. Limits on women's and children's labor, compulsory rest days, and maternity funds. At the same time, they encouraged cities to expand services, especially in the north. Municipal welfare, housing, water, sewage, tramways, gas, and electricity became fields where national policy landed in local hands. Those resources did not remain neutral. Local coalitions appropriated them. A municipal tramway did more than move people. It decided which neighborhoods joined the labor market early, which suburbs gained value, which workers secured stable employment, and which firms received contracts. Gasworks, water mains, electric plants, and public transport required capital, technical staff, and administrative competence. They also generated jobs, patronage, and territorial power. Northern municipalities used these instruments with wide discretion. In Milan and Turin, they steered tram lines and sewer projects toward growing industrial quarters and working-class suburbs. In smaller centers, municipal enterprise shielded local business against outside capital. Public utilities became tools for defending local interests, not neutral implements of national policy. The same logic shaped the countryside and the emerging districts. When protectionist tariffs on wheat and textiles arrived in the 1880s, provincial elites in Lombardy and Emilia adjusted land taxes, backed agrarian credit, and supported cooperatives to protect farmers and small manufacturers. When labor laws arrived, local prefects and mayors decided how strictly to enforce them. Standards could be relaxed where firms claimed competitive weakness. Municipal and provincial institutions therefore transformed the liberal tools of tax codes, police powers, welfare funds, and public enterprises into elements of a negotiated order. The state a worker in Sesto San Giovanni or a sharecropper outside Bologna met around 1900 was not simply Rome. It was a municipal council, a cooperative, a parish network, a party circle, and a prefect's office, all entangled with one another. The liberal state gained reach and lost purity. Its presence in northern localities depended on alliances with actors who treated legality as a flexible resource. Industrialization and municipal activism opened new fault lines. The old conflict between peasant communities and fiscal military administrators persisted, but it was now overlaid by conflicts between landowners and agrarian socialists, factory owners and organized labor, secular Republicans, and a resurgent Catholic movement. These fights were about control of the very institutions through which the liberal state reached local life. In Emilia-Romagna and the Lower Po Valley, agrarian socialism became a dense fabric of leagues, cooperatives, and peasant trade unions. It organized wage laborers and sharecroppers and gave the socialist movement a rural mass base that was rare elsewhere in Europe. These red leagues bargained over wages and contracts, boycotted hostile landowners, and channeled disputes into socialist-controlled arbitration. Catholic circles and landowner-backed white leagues formed in parallel, with their own mutual societies and hiring halls. Bologna, Ferrara, and Reggio Emilia became sites of triangular struggle. Socialist and Catholic rural organizations used the legal framework of association and strike to pressure agrarians. Landowners appealed to prefects and courts to protect property and order. Municipal institutions sat at the center of these contests. Councils decided whether socialist or Catholic cooperatives could run labor exchanges, whether contracts went to red firms or white firms, and how far strikes would be tolerated. Rome alternated between repression and accommodation, especially under Giolitti, who tried to draw socialists and Catholics into parliamentary life while using prefects and police to limit radicalization. The same system that introduced social legislation and widened the franchise also tolerated, and at times encouraged, private strikebreakers and armed escorts for blacklegs when employers demanded them. Private force and public police often acted together to restore production. In industrial towns, the conflict took another form. Worker politics in Sesto San Giovanni and similar centers moved through associational cultures. Sports clubs, mutual aid institutions, political circles, cultural groups, and municipal spaces. Factory owners asked municipalities and prefects for protection against strikes and boycotts. Workers asked the same authorities for schools, housing, utilities, and recognition as citizens. A liberal state defined by parliamentary representation and equal legal status became entangled with local expectations of social rights. These conflicts sharpened the center-periphery tension. Northern municipalities used their fiscal capacity and organizational strength to shape national reforms in their favor. Poorer southern and rural administrations often lacked the same capacity. When Rome subsidized municipal welfare and infrastructure, it conceded that northern cities were best placed to deliver such projects. Northern elites then resented attempts to standardize taxation and spending in ways that limited their discretion. The state tried to universalize norms, yet those norms depended on local authorities for implementation, and those authorities insisted on their own bargains. For all the change in scale and vocabulary, the world of 1880 to 1914 still carried the marks of older conflicts. The actors had changed. Industrialists, socialist organizers, Catholic cooperative leaders, and technical professionals now stood beside older landowners and lawyers. But the structural position of the local broker remained. The same layer of provincial notables and capable men who had once mediated between village communities and 18th century states, now mediated between industrial districts, peasant leagues, and a liberal national regime. Family lines carried the continuity. Local landowners or lawyers who had resisted Napoleonic conscription or negotiated restoration tax burdens had sons who sat on the boards of cooperative banks, on municipal councils, and on parliamentary commissions. Their inherited skills translated easily. Manipulating tax lists and conscription rolls became the art of steering public works, channeling credit, managing municipal contracts, and deciding which associations received support. Liberal legality kept the same blend of formalism and flexibility. The codes defined rights of association, strike, and municipal self-government. Their application turned on local authorities. Prefects dissolved subversive leagues under public order provisions and tolerated them when expedient. Municipal enterprises were justified as public interest and used to favor friendly contractors and cooperatives. By 1914, northern Italy had traveled far from the world of noble bandits and composite states. It had not arrived at a liberalism of impersonal rules and anonymous markets. The liberal state had been pulled down into the municipal arena, where industrialization, cooperation, and agrarian mobilization reshaped it into something more parochial, negotiated, and locally embedded. The First World War pushed the liberal state deeper into northern Italian society than any earlier crisis. From 1915, the state that had bargained with notables and municipal councils began to claim men, grain, animals, labor, and obedience in the name of a nation at war. Those universal claims collided with village economies, existing patronage, and the uneven ability of prefects, mayors, and Carabinieri to enforce them. Rural mobilization had two faces. The army drafted millions of peasant conscripts from Lombardy, the Veneto, Friuli, and Emilia. The home front absorbed their absence through new forms of labor, welfare, and control. Agriculture suffered heavy requisitions and labor losses, but peasant producers kept bargaining power because the state still had to feed both cities and armies. Wartime need accelerated changes already underway. Mechanization, women's labor, market integration, and a broader administrative reach. Friuli makes the dynamic concrete. The region became a rear area for the Isonzo front and then a partly occupied zone. Villages hosted troops, hospitals, depots, transport columns, and military authorities. Land and people came under extraordinary powers. Women, old men, and youths took over field work from conscripted men, while soldiers' families survived on erratic allowances, municipal relief, informal credit, and parish support. The wartime state acquired a daily presence far more intrusive than the pre-war regime had managed. Yet this presence still flowed through familiar intermediaries: mayors, parish priests, councillors, municipal clerks, and the rural Carabinieri station. Food shortages, inflation, and the distribution of army allowances produced protest, especially in the north. Bread riots erupted in Turin and Milan. Women demonstrated in smaller towns. War industries saw strikes. Rural unrest broke out in scattered districts. The language of protest remained local and moral. Protesters denounced profiteers and speculators, appealed to municipal authorities, and resented a sacrifice that seemed to fall hardest on small producers and workers. The state responded with repression and selective welfare at once. The Interior Ministry and the Army High Command ran censorship, surveillance, and military justice. Prefects and Carabinieri monitored defeatist talk and broke strikes under emergency powers. At the same time, the government built new instruments of social protection: pensions and allowances for soldiers' families, provisions for widows and disabled veterans, and food supply boards that regulated grain and bread. The war forced a rudimentary welfare state into being. Its implementation was patchy, and it depended on local administrative capacity. For rural northern households, the result cut both ways. Conscription and mass mobilization created unprecedented contact with the national state. The burdens of war also exposed the gap between universalist rhetoric and lived experience. Large landowners and contractors profited from high prices and military orders. Smallholders saw livestock requisitioned, labor drained, and prices outrun wages and allowances. Wartime mobilization layered a national demand for sacrifice on top of old inequalities. Many conscripts came home with raised expectations and sharper resentments. They had survived total war for the homeland, only to return to insecure jobs, rising prices, and familiar local hierarchies. Demobilization after 1918 left the northern countryside holding three new things at once. Millions of veterans with experience of organization and violence, a thin but real memory of national solidarity and welfare, and a hardened grievance against those who had profited. The conflict between universal claims and local economies entered the post-war years in an explosive form. The post-war years turned latent tension into open conflict. Italy had won the war but failed to use victory to consolidate its political system. Heavy casualties, unfulfilled territorial promises, inflation, unemployment, and polarization produced a legitimacy crisis concentrated in the industrial north and the Po Valley. Between 1919 and 1920, the Red Years brought an unprecedented wave of strikes, factory occupations, and rural unrest across the regions where pre-war local activism had been strongest. In Turin and Milan, metalworkers built factory councils and experimented with workers' control. In Emilia, Lombardy, and the Veneto, socialist and Catholic rural organizations used strikes, boycotts, and land seizures to renegotiate contracts and local power. The associational infrastructure built before the war became the backbone of mobilization. Socialist and Catholic leagues, cooperatives, and mutual aid societies had long managed hiring, wages, welfare, and the arbitration of disputes. After 1918, socialist leagues and cooperatives coordinated strikes and land occupations, while Catholic organizations built a parallel confessional route. In much of the Po Valley, these associations governed large areas of social life. They regulated labor markets, set wages, controlled access to machinery, organized welfare and credit, and arbitrated disputes. Formal local authorities often appeared weak beside party and associational power. The state's universal laws and administrative structures sat above this landscape. In daily life, peasants and laborers experienced power through the Red League or the White League. The result was a three-cornered struggle. Peasants, sharecroppers, and day laborers pressed for better contracts through their organizations. Landowners and large tenants defended control over estates, labor, and local office, often through their own associations and private guards. Prefects, police, and courts tried to hold order while national governments came and went. In the industrial north, the crisis peaked in the factory occupations of autumn 1920. Workers in Turin, Milan, and Genoa seized plants, raised red flags, and ran machinery under their own councils. Many contemporaries saw the beginning of revolution. Giolitti chose calculated passivity. He refused to send troops against the occupations and hoped the movement would exhaust itself. That decision had two consequences. It encouraged both socialists and employers to test how far they could press without provoking a decisive crackdown. Rural leagues escalated their demands. Land seizures spread. Industrialists and agrarians began to doubt that the state would protect property. The absence of a clear state monopoly over coercion pushed propertied groups towards self-organization. Industrialists formed Confindustria in 1919. Agrarian elites strengthened their federations and attached paramilitary auxiliaries. Demobilized officers and veterans supplied the skills, weapons, and style of violence suited to mass intimidation. When the socialist opening of 1919-1920 closed through compromise, exhaustion, and division, many small proprietors, shopkeepers, and rural middle strata experienced the same years as a slide into disorder that the state had failed to arrest. The liberal regime neither fully repressed these movements nor integrated them. It floated above an increasingly polarized local field, leaving room for a third force that promised order and national renewal while working through concrete local alliances. Fascism emerged inside this fractured field. It joined a narrative of national rebirth and centralization to practices embedded in local conflict. The Po Valley was its laboratory. Early fascist violence concentrated where socialist and Catholic associations were strong, and wartime mobilization had been heavy. In Emilia and the lower Po provinces, squads recruited from veterans, sons of landowners, estate bailiffs, clerks, and lower middle-class youth. They launched punitive expeditions against leagues and cooperatives. These bands attacked chambers of labor, cooperative stores, people's houses, union offices, and socialist-held municipal halls. They restructured local power by destroying archives, beating or killing organizers, forcing resignations, and imposing labor contracts favorable to landowners. The work depended on collaboration between violence and official authority. Agrarian elites and industrialists supplied money, vehicles, information, and legitimacy. Squads benefited from the complicity of parts of the state, weapons from army depots, tolerance from local authorities, and lenient treatment from police and courts. Prefects and police often treated fascist bands as auxiliaries against subversion and applied the law far more strictly to socialist self-defense. Bologna in November 1920 shows the pivot. Socialist candidates won municipal elections and the new council tried to assert control. Landowner and middle-class hostility converged. A confrontation in Piazza Nettuno ended with police fire and many dead. The government dissolved the council, and squads escalated their attacks across the province. When liberal institutions appeared to side with the left, agrarian and urban elites turned decisively to extra-parliamentary violence. In many northern communes, 3 security structures now operated in the same space: the Carabinieri station, the municipal police, and the squatters' patrol. After the March on Rome in 1922, fascist power gave this structure a legal shell. The regime abolished elected municipal councils and replaced them with appointed podestas. It reinforced the prefects as agents of the Interior Ministry. It built corporatist bodies that folded employers and workers into state-supervised syndicates. Decisions were meant to flow from Rome through ministries, prefectures, communes, and corporations. In the countryside, these reforms worked through continuity rather than rupture. Replacing elected mayors rarely brought anonymous outsiders. In many towns, local notables who had held office as liberals or moderates accepted appointment. Elsewhere, fascist organizers from the same milieu, lawyers, surveyors, merchants, sons of proprietors, became municipal heads. Local party federations, landowner associations, Catholic elites, and prefects negotiated the choices. The regime depended on local elites and state officials for daily operation. Repression sealed the fusion. In the first half of the 1920s, squads and public authorities together closed chambers of labor, confiscated cooperative assets, and forced militants into exile, prison, or silence. The associational infrastructure that had allowed local society to bargain under its own banners either disappeared or reappeared as fascist mass organizations. The regime kept the informal enforcement of the squad years alive beside formal institutions. One axis ran through party, state, and corporations. Another continued through selective violence, patronage, and personal protection. In the Po Valley, property conflicts, labor disputes, and private quarrels still moved through networks of party bosses, police officials, and businessmen. Squads became the voluntary militia for national security and blended into the broader apparatus. Many of their leaders took posts as mayors, provincial secretaries, or militia commanders. Fascism therefore resolved part of the liberal crisis for local elites and extended the rest. It suppressed the open pluralism of leagues and cooperatives that had challenged landowners in 19 and 1920. It also built a more coherent national language tying village ritual to Rome through memorials, parades, youth organizations, and welfare. Yet access to land, credit, jobs, and protection in northern communities still turned on personal ties to local elites and party figures. The slogans of one people, one leader, and one law did not become impersonal, uniformly applied rule in the countryside. The long conflict had passed through a violent centralizing turn. The war had drawn peasants into a national effort without stable reward. The Red Years had shown that local associations could govern themselves and face down central elites. Fascism then offered agrarian and urban notables, the lower middle classes, and parts of the state a way to regain control. Its means were explicitly illiberal, but the reliance on local intermediaries and discretionary governance survived under a new flag. The Second World War ended with northern and central Italy, crossed by partisan formations, allied military government, and revived prefectural offices. Municipal councils and resistance committees had begun to experiment with grassroots administration, yet the institutional shell of the pre-fascist liberal state survived across much of the north. Prefects, Carabinieri, civil codes, and a heavily centralized interior ministry. The settlement of 1946 to 1948 restored a liberal constitutional frame on top of this inherited apparatus. The June 1946 referendum abolished the monarchy. Elections produced a constituent assembly dominated by Christian Democrats, Socialists, and Communists. The Constitution was approved in December 1947 and came into force on the 1st of January 1948. The Charter proclaimed civil rights, an independent judiciary, and parliamentary government. In formal terms, the liberal state returned. It also kept the central state's grip on local society while conceding symbolic ground to autonomy. Article 5 captured the compromise. The Republic was declared one and indivisible. It recognized and promoted local autonomies, promised administrative decentralization, and adapted legislation to autonomy and decentralization. But unity came first, autonomy came after it. Regions, provinces, and communes appeared in later parts of the Constitution. For decades, however, many of their powers depended on ordinary legislation rather than self-executing guarantees. Ordinary statute regions did not take shape until 1970. In practice, northern localities met the Republican state through a familiar chain. Prefects represented the interior ministry in each province. The Carabinieri kept their double role as military force and rural police. Judges and prosecutors remained officers of a unified national career judiciary. The constitution promised rights and decentralization, but the daily presence of the state in a Lombard town or an Emilian village still ran through centrally appointed officials and national codes. The Constituent Assembly reflected the same ambivalence. Christian Democrats and liberals insisted on a strong center as guarantor of unity and conservative order. Communists and socialists pressed for social rights and regional self-government, yet they also accepted a powerful state able to deliver land reform, housing, and industrial policy. The text left wide discretion to ordinary politics. Local autonomy stood as an aspiration, but the detailed distribution of powers remained subject to parliamentary bargains and ministerial practice. After 1948, the state reached local society in two ways at once. It spoke the universal language of equal citizenship, rights, and judicial protection. It delivered those promises through the prefectural and uniform instruments inherited from pre-fascist Italy. The next round of mediation between national universalism and territorial particularism would now run through mass parties rather than old notables. From the late 1940s to the 1960s, the most powerful actors in local society were the mass parties. They rebuilt and extended territorial networks inherited from the resistance, the Catholic movement, and pre-fascist socialist organization. In the north and center, these networks hardened into political subcultures. Around each major party grew a world of institutions: newspapers, bars, theaters, schools, clinics, cooperatives, recreational circles, unions, and burial societies. In many places, a citizen could be born in a party-linked clinic, educated in party environments, employed through party-linked firms or cooperatives, entertained in party circles, and buried with party honors. The white subculture dominated parts of the Northeast, growing out of Catholic movements and Christian democracy. The red subculture prevailed in Emilia, Tuscany, Umbria, and the working-class zones of Turin, Milan, and Genoa. Both regulated the small firm economy through their control of municipalities, associations, and industrial relations. In the Catholic Christian democratic zones of the Veneto, Lombardy's smaller towns, Friuli and Trentino, parish activities, Catholic action, rural cooperatives, and welfare bodies allowed the party to control municipalities, channel state resources, and deliver votes. Christian democratic mayors and councillors distributed housing, building permits, and public sector jobs within this framework. The formal language remained equal citizenship and legal entitlement. Access often ran through the parish priest, the party secretary, or the Catholic trade union. In the Red Belt, the Communist Party built its own territorial world. Clubs, choirs, sports societies, cultural circles, cooperatives, festivals, and municipal services. Cooperatives, mutual societies, and cultural centers became pillars of communist local power. Municipal governments operated as administrative arms of this order. They favored cooperative enterprise in planning, used public works to stabilize employment, and turned schools and social services into showcases of good administration. Both zones resembled layered local states. At the constitutional level stood a neutral republic of uniform laws. On the ground stood systems in which residents of an Emilian town or a Veneto village depended on party affiliation, parish networks, cooperative membership, or local reputation for access to opportunity. Even the celebrated civic density of the North rested on organized collective life rather than disembodied liberal citizenship. In the 1950s and 1960s, that collective life was explicitly partisan. Housing laws, welfare benefits, public employment, and credit programs came from Rome. They took concrete form through municipal decisions and provincial patronage. Party intermediaries treated state resources as instruments for electoral support and organizational finance. The subcultures also constrained national institutions. Magistrates, prefects, and technical officials working in communist or Christian democratic areas had to navigate dense local allegiances. Formal orders from Rome competed with authority from party federations, bishops, cooperative federations, and union offices. The Republican Constitution imagined a hierarchy of norms. Lived practice inserted the parties as parallel rulemakers. The subcultures carried their own ethics. Catholic social doctrine and communist collectivism supported distinct notions of justice and deservingness. These overlapped only partially with liberal universalism. Many social programs arose less from abstract rights than from a clientelistic policy mode operating within Christian democracy's Catholic universe. In the red regions, redistribution moved through cooperative and union structures anchored in a class conception of solidarity. Liberal equality before the law supplied the constitutional background. The dominant moral codes in local society were Catholic and communist. Mass parties had occupied the mediating space between national law and local life. The liberal republic relied on their territorial networks to anchor its authority, at the price of letting them operate as quasi-local states. The tension between constitutional liberalism and party-based local regimes became more visible during the economic miracle. Industrial output expanded, millions moved from countryside to city, real incomes rose, especially in the north. Turin, Milan, Genoa, and the industrial belt drew labor from rural Veneto, the Po Valley, and the south into urban peripheries where services lagged behind demand. Local administrations run by Christian Democrats or communists acquired new fiscal resources and planning powers. They also faced mounting social struggle, yet internal security remained a central prerogative. The Interior Ministry supervised the state police and the Carabinieri. Prefects represented the ministry in each province. Public order decisions in contentious situations flowed down that chain. Regional and municipal authorities had little formal say, even where they held overwhelming electoral support. The Tambroni crisis of 1960 exposed the arrangement. A Christian democratic government, dependent on neo-fascist parliamentary votes, authorized the neo-fascist MSI to hold its national congress in Genoa, a city with a strong anti-fascist memory and a powerful left subculture. Protests erupted. Violent clashes with police followed. Disturbances spread to other cities. The government banned the Congress, and Tambroni resigned. Demonstrations in Genoa, Reggio Emilia, Rome, and other northern and central cities confronted national police acting under Interior Ministry directives. Communist and socialist organizations mobilized thousands. Some Christian democratic mayors attempted mediation, yet the decisions on bans, charges, and firearms passed through state channels insulated from local electoral majorities. The Republic asserted its monopoly of coercion in the name of public order. Many citizens in the red subculture, and even some in Catholic areas, experienced the state as a hostile force. The pattern returned in the industrial conflicts of the decade, most sharply at Fiat in Turin. The Piazza Statuto riots of July 1962 brought days of street fighting after a separate agreement signed by a moderate union. Municipal and provincial authorities in Turin operated within a Christian democratic frame and provided some infrastructure for new neighborhoods. They did not control the police units confronting demonstrators. The Communist Party and the CGIL Union tried to channel unrest into bargaining while avoiding being outflanked by more radical groups. The national state intervened through security forces in local conflicts, whose protagonists had been shaped by Northern Party subcultures. By the late 1960s, Northern Italy held a distinctive configuration. Constitutional liberalism ran at the top. National security forces enforced order. Entrenched party subcultures governed municipalities, shaped associational life, and mediated access to public goods. The liberal state had penetrated local society more deeply than before 1914, but it had done so through the very subcultural structures that limited the reach of its universalist ethic. The post-war liberal republican state had spent 2 decades pulling authority upward. Fiscal policy, welfare, industrial strategy, and policing accumulated in Rome and in the ministry's provincial offices. By the late 1960s, the architecture was creaking. The central bureaucracy treated Lombard valleys and Calabrian uplands through identical schemes. Local authorities complained that projects arrived late, misdesigned, and insulated from local knowledge. Regionalization and the rise of the Third Italy relocated the conflict between the liberal state and territorial society. They did not dissolve it. The center conceded formal spaces, regions, district policies, negotiated planning, within which northern municipalities, chambers of commerce, cooperatives, and family firms could articulate their interests. Those actors then used the new tools to harden an older style of localist governance, now dressed in republican legality and European development language. The constitution had promised regions as an intermediate level between communes and the state, but implementation stalled for more than 20 years. Special statute regions became operational earlier because of linguistic or insular claims. Ordinary regions, Piedmont, Lombardy, Veneto, Emilia-Romagna, and others, waited until 1970 to elect their first councils. From that point, Italy shifted from a unitary administrative state to a regionalized one. Sovereignty still centered in Rome, but routine policy-making and implementation increasingly ran through regional institutions. Regional councils gained legislative authority over healthcare, vocational training, parts of land use, and local economic development. Central ministries kept framework powers and money, but regions gained enough control over spending, planning, and administration to matter deeply. The new tier did not operate as a neutral conduit for central law. It rested on already dense networks of communes, cooperatives, professional associations, unions, business groups, and party branches. Regional councils gave those coalitions a higher stage with new budgets and planning instruments attached. In Lombardy and Emilia-Romagna, Christian democratic and communist subcultures had long treated local government as a resource for their clienteles. Regional health services, industrial estates, vocational training, and transport plans became objects of territorial negotiation. The liberal state accepted regionalization partly because it promised to stabilize the polity, It channeled centrifugal demands into elected bodies rather than street protest. But the reform also sharpened conflict inside the state. Central ministries tried to hold prerogatives through detailed framework laws and narrow readings of national competence. Regions pushed back where they had strong coalitions, especially in healthcare, infrastructure, and small firm industrial policy. Litigation before the Constitutional Court multiplied. In the North, these disputes rarely appeared as abstract sovereignty questions. They turned on who decided the location of a hospital, who authorized an industrial wastewater plant, who controlled vocational schools, and who could define local economic development. Uniform rules clashed with territorially specific compromises among local actors. Municipal and provincial elites could now claim to uphold the constitution because they operated through elected regional councils. At the same time, they continued to govern through embedded personal networks whose first loyalty lay with their own districts and valleys. As the legal architecture of regionalization took shape, the economic geography of the center-north shifted. From the late 1960s, a belt of rapidly industrializing provinces ran from Emilia-Romagna through the Veneto and Marche into northeastern Tuscany. It was built around dense clusters of small and medium manufacturing firms. This was the Third Italy, set against both the Fordist triangle of Turin, Milan, and Genoa, and the underdeveloped Mezzogiorno. It was marked by finely integrated urban and rural environments. Instead of large vertically integrated factories, the landscape held workshops, family firms, and specialized subcontractors. Shoes from the Riviera del Brenta, tiles from Sassuolo, furniture from Pesaro, machine tools from the Bolognese Apennines. Municipalities and provinces sat at the center of these networks. They built industrial estates, organized trade fairs, sponsored export consortia, and lobbied Rome and Brussels for infrastructure and subsidy tailored to their districts. Successful local development depended on coordination rather than either market anonymity or top-down command. Industrial associations, employers' organizations, trade unions, chambers of commerce, universities, schools, civic groups, and environmental organizations could all take part in analysis, consultation, and planning. Local government could depart from the traditional top-down bureaucratic approach and become broker, organizer, and coordinator of local strategy. In Emilia-Romagna, communist-led municipalities pioneered this broker role. They co-financed real services, quality control laboratories, design centers, technical assistance that individual family firms could not afford. Chambers of commerce collected data and promoted export consortia. Regional governments added framework laws on districts and channeled European money into training. In the Veneto and the March, politics leaned more Christian democratic and small business oriented, more conservative, and more tied to parishes and family firms. Yet the mechanism resembled Emilia-Romagna's. Local public bodies supported territorially specific production systems rather than applying neutral horizontal policies. The model strengthened the image of the liberal state. The districts generated exports, jobs, and tax revenue, while the old industrial triangle struggled with crisis and deindustrialization. They fostered participation and associational life that looked healthier than clientelism. Emilia-Romagna became the model of the civic community. Cooperatives, trust in local government, and dense public-private coordination. Yet the mechanisms that made the districts work rested on selective, embedded relationships. Chambers of commerce, cooperatives, and municipal offices knew exactly who belonged to the local business community. Subsidies, serviced land, market intelligence, and contracts flowed through those channels. Outsiders struggled to enter. Rival firms from neighboring areas faced invisible barriers on foreign territory. The liberal ideal of an impersonal market regulated by uniform national law sat uneasily beside a reality in which industrial policy, credit, land, public works, and information hinged on dense personal ties among local elites. By the late 1980s, regionalization and the Third Italy had produced a paradox. On paper, Italy had moved closer to a liberal democratic design, multi-level representative institutions, constitutional guarantees of local autonomy, competition policy increasingly harmonized with Europe, and a uniform civil and commercial code. In practice, the most successful northern regions governed through a territorial corporatism that broke as much as it embodied those principles. The district model also showed its limits. Local development based primarily on small firm networks struggled with innovation that required larger capital pools and national infrastructure. Computer-aided design, telecommunications, advanced machinery, and modern research exceeded the capacity of many family firms. The districts depended on national and European systems even as their internal organization revolved around local networks. European integration added pressure. The Single European Act and the reform of the structural funds encouraged endogenous development, while warning against the patchwork of local regimes competing through lower wages, weaker taxes, and lax environmental standards. Supra-local minimum standards were meant to prevent destructive local competition. Those safeguards ran against local bargains in which municipalities quietly tolerated overtime abuses, grey labor, or lax enforcement to keep local firms competitive. In the Third Italy, office work and underreporting coexisted with export success. Local authorities shared the same social milieu as entrepreneurs and artisans. They faced strong pressure to protect local competitiveness against national regulation portrayed as burdensome. Inspectors who pushed too hard risked isolation. The regional tier magnified the ambivalence. Center-North regions used their powers to formalize support for districts, training laws, export promotion, innovation agencies, and cluster policies. They were less willing to impose stricter general standards on local practice. They negotiated with central ministries to adapt national rules to local conditions and mobilized in Brussels for favorable readings of state aid and competition law. The conflict was framed in the technocratic language of subsidiarity and appropriate levels of governance. Beneath that language lay an older claim. Local society would rule itself by criteria rooted in its own history, even where those criteria clashed with liberal universalism. Regionalization and the Third Italy did not complete the transition from particulars to orders to an impersonal liberal state. Older localism returned in civilian form as municipal and regional corporatism. Family firms replaced armed retinues. Cooperative leagues and chambers of commerce replaced private chanceries. European funds and regional laws replaced seigneurial tolls. Local coalitions anchored in land, workshops, and associations used each institutional innovation to reassert their primacy against central universalist projects. By 1990, the state had accepted much of this settlement. It constitutionalized regions, celebrated districts, and gave municipal and regional bodies wide discretion over local economic life. It gained stability and growth at the cost of entrenching a governance in which citizenship, rights, and opportunity were still mediated through local belonging rather than guaranteed by universal, impersonal rule. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the North's liberal republican state had also become a machine for financing parties and governing cities through corrupt exchange. In Milan and other northern centers, public contracts, urban projects, hospital construction, municipal utilities, and parastatal resources depended on routinized kickbacks. A market for corrupt exchange formed. Political and administrative actors supplied decisions. Firms bought access and protection. The whole system was regulated by an informal institutional order that governed the hidden side of public life. Formal legality set the stage. Administrative law, procurement rules, European directives, and regional planning defined which projects could proceed, how tenders ran, and which constraints applied. Inside that legal shell, party organizations and local brokers used the same instruments as bargaining chips. Lombardy, Piedmont, Liguria, and the Veneto concentrated major public works and state-linked industry. Transport, energy and gas distribution, hospitals, utilities, and construction. Milan's municipal and regional elite controlled dense networks of public companies, banks, and special authorities that blurred the line between bureaucracy and business. By the 1980s, clientelism and outright corruption had fused. Party financing depended on it. Political cohesion depended on it. Public contracts became channels through which firms bought inclusion in a protected circle and parties raised funds. The chain ran from Rome's ministries to regional governments down to city halls and municipal companies. The proportional electoral system gave individual politicians incentives to raise funds for their own factions. Business politicians specialized in converting access to ministries or key local offices into bribes, party contributions, and favors. Northern cities stood at the center. Milan's image as moral capital and showcase of post-war growth did not prevent it from becoming the core of Tangentopoli. The concentration of banks, headquarters, and construction firms made it fertile ground for collusive tendering. Formal competitive procedures survived, but consortia and cartels arranged outcomes in advance and priced the bribe in as a regular cost. Local society was deeply implicated. Not only businessmen and politicians, but ordinary citizens became drawn into forms of clientelism or petty illegality, because corruption functioned as a lubricant inside an otherwise unresponsive bureaucracy. Small and medium firms needed permits, credit, and contracts. Professionals sought planning variances or hospital posts. Families pursued council housing or preferential treatment in schools and clinics. Access traveled through party sections, local notables, union intermediaries, civic associations, and professional circles. Many of these doubled as channels for donations and informal payments. The liberal state did not erase older municipal and district traditions. It became one node inside local coalitions. Civic elites in Bergamo, Vicenza, Reggio Emilia, and Milan negotiated with regional and national authorities over infrastructure, taxation, and regulatory treatment. Parties guaranteed flows of contracts, posts, and subsidies to their territories. Local societies accepted an arrangement in which universal legality remained in the constitution, while everyday governance rested on mediated access and selective enforcement. Systemic corruption worked as a mode of governance. It allocated rents from public investment. It stabilized party organizations. It bound local notables to the center. It also hollowed out the liberal claim that citizenship conferred equal standing before an impersonal law. The institutions charged with upholding legality now moved against the networks through which the state had been governing. The break began in Milan. On the 17th of February 1992, Mario Chiesa, a Socialist Party appointed manager of a Milanese care home, was arrested for taking a relatively modest bribe. The arrest set off a sequence that exposed the architecture of Tangentopoli. The Milan pool of magistrates used plea bargaining, pre-trial detention, and a sharp media strategy to pry open chains of corrupt exchange tying local officials, national politicians, and business elites together. The novelty lay less in discovering corruption than in exposing centrally organized systems of illegal party financing and agreements between politicians and businessmen that had long been tolerated. What surfaced looked like a parallel fiscal system. Public contracts, concessions, and zoning decisions financed parties and enriched intermediaries. The system was heaviest in major northern jurisdictions,